Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. And today's question is really a fun one, and it really tells us a lot about the way we think about music history and the great composers. The question is from a viewer, and thank you very much, Mr. Viewer, for asking this. Why are there so many more great Baroque composers than classical period composers? ? Well, the short answer is there aren't. It's a total illusion. But let me explain to you how the illusion happens. First, we have to talk about periodicity. That is how we conceive the various musical periods. It is a fact that as we are closer in time to the periods in question get shorter, because we tend to focus on small details and blow them up into large stylistic changes. Let me give you an example. What we're talking about, the classical period that we're talking about generally goes, most people think, from around the birth of Mozart, so around, 1756, to the death of Beethoven, which is 1827, or thereabouts, 28, 29, up until 1830. Let's be generous, right? So how long is that? 1756, round up to 1760, 40, 70 years. Okay? The Baroque period, most people would say, begins with Monteverdi's Orfeo, or the 8th book of madrigals. So we're talking about 16 something like that, and ends with the death of Bach or maybe Handel. So we're talking 1765. So 1610 to 1765, what's that, 150 years? So you're comparing a period that's twice as long with one half the length. So obviously more people are going to fit into a century and a half than are going to fit into 6 or 7 decades. So that's one reason that the appearance is terribly lopsided. The other reason is a function of our own stylistic parameters, how we think of things in terms of style. For example, 2 of the finest classical period composers who seldom get included in the classical period, and we always include the classical period, it's Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, right? 3, the big 3. That's all we talk about. And it's only in Vienna that this happened. Well, obviously it didn't just happen in Vienna. It happened in lots of places. And there were wonderful composers in those other places. There definitely were. I mean, where do you put somebody like Rameau, who, was around for longer than the death of Mozart and of Bach or Handel, or Gluck, for example? So, yeah, there are more than you think. Let's put it that way. So on the right-hand side, on the post-classical side, Schubert, one of the great classical composers. Yes, he died very young. He's often considered proto-romantic. But his life occurred entirely within the classical period, really within Beethoven's lifetime. And he was a classical period composer. The other great opera, there are 2 great opera composers. One on the left, who I just mentioned, Gluck, who was a classical period composer without a doubt, and a very, very important one, and a master, no question about it. And then Rossini was one of the most fascinating of all, because he was a classical composer of opera and a romantic composer of piano works, because he didn't die till the 1860s, but he gave up writing opera. He retired as an opera composer again in the 1820s. By the death of Beethoven, Rossini had retired, and all of his work was done in the classical period, and he was a classical period composer without a doubt. Without any doubt whatsoever. And so they get left out. So there's more than just Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Or what, aside from Gluck, Boccherini, who was one of the most important progenitors of classical period chamber music and an absolute master. I mean, there's no question about it. He gets disregarded because he wasn't Viennese, although he was in Vienna, by the way. But he was Italian, and he spent most of his life in Spain. So there is an illusory historicity, I don't know what you want to call it, but just way of looking at these composers and their biographies that makes it seem that the classical period was much less rich in musical talent than the Baroque period was. But it's absolutely not true. It is completely untrue. And one of the other interesting things about the way we think about these periods is that Bernstein, for example, considered the classical period, when he did his young people's concerts and all that, the classical period, he said, began with Bach and Handel. He included them in the classical composers because as a practical musician, they are the first major composers whose music is part of the classical repertoire that gets played. The great works of Bach, the cantatas, the B minor mass, the keyboard works, and Handel's Messiah and things like that. Those, even though swaths of their music were out of style for a long period of time, and also their actual aesthetic was more Baroque than the classical musical aesthetic. If you think about periodicity in the wider sense as repertoire, the classical repertoire, then you would have to include Bach and Handel. And so the classical period gets extended hugely from, say the 1720s, say around then, when Bach and Handel were enjoying their early maturity, 1710s, all the way up to about 1830. So there you get about 110 years, and you kind of equalize things with the Baroque. And that stuffs the Baroque period back with people like Corelli and the earlier Germans like Bieber. And you can do it a lot of ways. It all depends on how you look at it and how you lump them together. I mean, that's really, really the answer to the question. It's very convenient. Ultimately, the question is one of convenience. It's very convenient to talk about Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven because they wrote tons of music. And they are, you can look at them as a world unto themselves, as the classical period. But, I mean, you don't want to leave out C.P.E. Bach, do you? He was also a composer of the classical period, although he served as a transition from the Baroque to the classical. And, I understand that in the Baroque period, you've got like a billion Italians. You have Vivaldi and Corelli and Torelli and Tortoni and Spumoni and Espresso and Salumeria and all of those guys. I mean, they're all in there. And in the Germans, too. I mean, you've got Bieber and Schmelzer and Spelzer and Blitzen and Donner and Rudolph. They're all in there. So, yes, there are lots and lots and lots of names. And the last criterion that we need to consider is what do we consider to be great composers? The Baroque period had lots of composers. They weren't all great composers. They weren't all astonishingly great composers. They may have been terribly prolific. I mean, Locatelli wrote tons of stuff. The person, not the cheese. He wrote very well. Most of these people were quite accomplished, but they were writing in what we call a common practice style, one where there were a lot of sort of conventions that made it very easy to generate tons and tons of music very quickly. And it would all sound somewhat similar, being of its type, according to procedures that were well understood and generally practiced. And so it was easy to churn out tons of stuff. And it's also very difficult, quite frankly, to determine which are individualistic masterpieces. There's a difference between working in a style where you have to show your personality with every work, and it has to be different from every other work, and working in a style where you are operating according to a preset pattern. And it's very easy to take all of these Baroque composers who wrote concerti grossi or solo concertos and opera seria and things like that, and say, well, they all sound kind of alike, so they're all equally good. That's a matter of individual taste. I don't think you can apply the epithet great or greatness to music of that sort willy-nilly. It takes a lot more serious listening and nuance than that. And we don't have a lot of time for that kind of nuance. We really don't. It's very easy just to say, well, it's all this great Baroque stuff. And you can lump them all in a group. I used to say, as a joke with friends, we used to say, you should take every great organ work and just say Bach wrote it. Because that way it'll get played. And they all sound kind of the same anyway. You know, these staccatas and fugues and things, you know. And no one's going to much know the difference. And it's true, they don't. I mean, a good bit of Bach's organ music may not be by Bach, and nobody knows any. I mean, nobody can prove it one way or another, and we're happy to accept it. So the idea of great as unique and personal does not apply to older music as it does to newer music. And that's not surprising either, because we're further away in time. And the further away in time we get, the more it all tends to sound similar, which is the point I made at the beginning. And the harder it is to differentiate one composer from another composer if they're working broadly within a similar style. It's much easier just to say, well, they're all terrific, and leave it at that. So I hope this sort of explains to you how the illusion of there being fewer great classical composers is just that. It all has to do with historical convenience, how we listen, what our use of the music is, and how we organize it for our own convenience. I mean, it's about convenience. That's the bottom line. It's not historical in any factual sense. You can organize these people however you want. And so, yes, it is an illusion. And let's not forget, as a last shot, all the wonderful classical composers we don't talk about. The Mannheim School, all of them, the Stomitzes and Vogler and I mean, there were a million of those, Richter, and they're very good. Very, very good. The French revolutionary composers, Gossec, Méhul, people like that. We have all of the other Viennese composers who were, copying Haydn like crazy, Pleyel and Van Hal and Garowitz, and they're all getting recorded by Naxos and CPO, and the music's lovely. Michael Haydn, for heaven's sake, right? There's a lot of it, and a lot of it's very good. It's really, really very good. And if we wanted to, treat the classical period the way we treat the Baroque period, then we could come up with the several dozen names, and the illusion of their numerical superiority would vanish, poof, like a soap bubble. So thank you for asking the question. I hope this answers it, and keep on listening. Take care.